Welcome to the next discussion forum, which is on conservation in the context of rising crime and illegal activities. I will provide a little bit of a background for this discussion forum, and then I will introduce the speakers, and they will have around 10 minutes each, and then we will have a discussion or Q&A time to discuss any questions. So, as environmental crime continues to rise, conservation is being shaped by insecurity, organized crime, and governance gaps. This panel explores conservation as a social, political, and economic challenge embedded in contexts of crime, inequality, and weak enforcement. Drawing on interdisciplinary perspectives, the discussion will explore how conservation actors respond to criminal networks, how communities are affected, and what integrated strategies can enhance both environmental protection and security. So for this discussion, we have three amazing speakers. Firstly, we have Liliana Davalos, who is joining us through Zoom, because I think this picture kind of explains her situation. She's stranded in New York and she couldn't come, which was the initial plan. So Liliana is an evolutionary and conservation biologist whose research focuses on the deep history of biodiversity and its implications for conservation. A Colombian-born scientist based in the United States, Liliana studies bats as model systems to understand the ecological and evolutionary impacts of tropical deforestation. Liliana is a professor at Stony Brook University, where her work integrates phylogenetics, molecular evolution, and tropical biology to examine how biodiversity originates and changes over time. Her research aims to inform science-based policies that support the conservation of ecosystems now and into the future, and she will deliver a talk titled Risk from Criminal Governance in the Amazon. Our second speaker is Hernan Alvarez, and his presentation is titled The Complexities of Tackling Illegal Behaviors in Wildlife Conservation. Hernan is a conservation social scientist focused on the human dimensions of natural resource conservation. He is currently a PhD candidate in the interdisciplinary ecology with a concentration in sociology, and he will be defending in a couple of weeks his work. Hernan has over a decade of experience in wildlife management and conservation. His research explores compliance with wildlife trade regulations in the western Amazon of Ecuador, with broader interest in community-based conservation, environmental governance, behavioral change, and conservation planning. And last but not least is Johanna Espin, whose talk is titled Governance of Environmental and Organized Crime in the Amazon. And Johanna is a sociologist whose work explores the intersections of environmental justice, criminology, and public policy in Latin America. She serves as a theme lead of the last Power of Connections workshop, which was titled Indigenous Rights and Governance Instruments. And she brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of environmental governance and social equity. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Florida and a master's in social sciences and a specialization in human rights and public policy. Her research examines environmental crime, governance, and the social dimensions of law, with particular attention to the design of knowledge systems and participatory policy approaches aimed at advancing more just and sustainable societies. So we will start with Liliana Davalos, and yes, the mic is yours now.
Okay, thank you everyone. I hope that you can hear me. Yes, that was a picture outside my window. If you paid attention, the road seems to have been clear, so I'm hoping that flights resume tomorrow. So let's hope for that. So I'm gonna skip, earlier today we heard a series of statements that actually touched on what I was gonna use as an introduction. And because this is like a 10-minute presentation, I'm gonna skip about some of that, but some of those highlights are a kind of qualitative change in the rate in which crime is being committed. Notice that it is now a lot, there's a lot more of it, and it's a lot more interconnected, and it's not just one thing. It can't be construed in one thing. And also the relationship with murders, targeted murders of activists across several borders, as well as Simonia Taida's statement about the lack of alternatives that are happening, especially at places like triple borders. So I'm going to skip over these slides and just say that by 2022 or so, when I started becoming interested in this, and this is a very large investigation that came out called Amazon Underworld that came out in 2023, 2024. I was very skeptical of this because in the past I had been commissioned by the United Nations to actually try to find out what the impact of illicit coca cultivation, which is a problem in the Andean region, of course, and in the countries of the Andean region that produce coca, it spills over into the Amazonian region of all three countries. And I was asked to actually kind of measure that. And the result of that analysis was that it wasn't the way that people wanted to construe it. So a lot of voices were out there at this time. This is now more than 10 years old, but at this time, the idea is like coca cultivation is this huge pathway of destruction in different regions. And then when you actually did the math across studies, some of these are mine, some of these are from other people, you actually get very different results at the time, in which you're seeing that the deforestation is actually mostly associated with pasture, with cattle ranching, which was also mentioned earlier, and only a very tiny minority has to do with coca cultivation. In other words, the statement or the papers that I published at the time actually were talking more about coca being somewhat of a passenger and not a key driver in this particular locations based on mathematical analysis. Of course, that's just to say that I was skeptical. I didn't think that it was quite as big, but I wanted to answer some questions. And then this is a paper about inequality that Davalos Armenteras, who's my collaborator on this project, and that we published a while ago. And so I wanted to answer some questions regarding this crime, this growth of crime in the Amazon. What has changed? How did it change? Where did it change? And what can we do? Hopefully we'll have time to kind of touch on this. And one of the things that has changed the most is something that can be quantified in some parts of the world, like in Europe. You can actually, if you look at this plot, we have the metabolite concentration. So these are when people consume cocaine, some of the derivatives actually make it into the water flows. They go into the waste, and then you can monitor them at the station. And I want to draw your attention to this because numerically, this is actually quite nice. If you had invested your money, like $10,000 at the beginning of this period, if you had invested in 2011, $10,000, you would now have $60,000 because this has multiplied, or 70,000 because this has multiplied by 7 times. So this is an annual rate that is about 17%. But that's not the only thing that we see here. The other thing that we notice here is that not all cities start at the same time. So as we go, each of the colors of the dots on each line corresponds to one municipal sewer. And this municipal sewers, over time, there are more and more places that are recording the consumption of cocaine by people. And so once you take that into account, you've got this exponential dynamics where you have a growth rate of about 16%. So that's to say that one of the things that has changed is that the magnitude of the consumption that is happening in places where it can be monitored relatively well, like in Europe, is growing and has been growing exponentially for more than a decade. This has a counterpart that takes us into the Amazonian, the legal Amazon of Brazil, and these are just data from the federal government. There are also other sources of data that I'm not taking into account here. And you notice that if you look at the y-axes of those y-axes are actually growing logarithmically, meaning that if you have a straight line growing logarithmically, once again, you have this exponential dynamics. This time, we can see the localization of the increasing quantities of cocaine that is flowing through Amazonian Brazil. And we see that, again, there's kind of a lot of variance across them, but this is a growth of about 8%. So we have a 16% growth in the consumption, at least in European markets. And in Brazil, we have about an 8% growth beginning in 2013 when these data start through 2024. There's also, parallel to this, we can actually see dynamics that mirror it that have to do with the gold connection. And that is the reality that these illegal activities are not confined. Once you have the establishment of a particular criminal network, they do not stay with just one commodity. And so once again, we can look at data from the federal government and see how much is being collected in taxes that are associated with gold across the Amazon. And we see that this has also been showing an exponential rate for that period. And again, You see some fluctuations, like starting around 2020 or something. There's a somewhat different dynamic, but on average, you have this rapid growth. So the question of what has changed, well, the consumption in some markets, and there are markets that we just don't have the numbers to study, but that there are reports that are growing very rapidly, and we don't have quantitative data, is growing very rapidly. The amount of cocaine that is flowing through Amazonia and Brazil, as opposed to other routes that used to be used or that were more important in the past, has also been increasing, has been increasing exponentially, albeit more slowly. I think the people in this audience are familiar with a lot of the events that play a role in this qualitative change. And that requires, one of the great things about being in a space like this is that there are lots of different perspectives from sociology and from other forms of science that aren't just environmental science that are necessary to understand how the political economy of the countries and of the Amazon has been transformed. And that political economy has been transformed by some of the events that I'm presenting here, like the rise of prison gangs as organized criminal groups that can actually interconnect transnationally with one another, the demobilization of large guerrilla movements in Colombia that was only partial and left some of those guerrilla movements or some of those fronts from the FARC or from the former FARC to their actions or their interconnections with the state of Venezuela, as well as other events that are transformative to the place. And of course, we're all living in the shadow of the way the state had to retract or reacted by retracting from a lot of its functions, especially its functions in territorial control during the COVID pandemic initial crisis. And this had also had a catalytic effect because we were already under circumstances where we had this very relatively weak grasp of movements across borders and relatively weak control. And now we have this compounding that is happening during that period. And so we have entered into a new period that doesn't look like, even though the elements may be the same, like in my case, trying to understand what coca cultivation is doing or what cocaine transactions are doing, the way and the scale in which they're being done and the transnational links are now maximized. So that gives us a geography that is highlighted here. And earlier, Simonia Taide was talking about the triple border of Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, and that's one of the hotspots. But we also have the other triple borders, for example, in Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru, becoming, as well as the less patrolled ones with Venezuela or with Ecuador, they're becoming this tremendous hotspots of illegal activity and incredibly important for this new transnational business networks that are legal business networks. So this is this is a graph about some of the larger cocaine seizures from 2024, and then you can see that this transnational movement is happening throughout. So the question is then, what does this have to do with the environment? If anything, it's just a problem for criminologists, and of course the reality is that it has a huge impact. And one of those impacts that can be best tracked is in Peru, where the departamentos that are at the border are actually suffering the most, and they're having this. So here we've got coca cultivation and forest loss, and you can see that these are growing in an allometric scale, meaning that they're scaling in logarithmic scales on both sides, and they are growing the most. As you can see, most recently is where you see a huge amount of deforestation associated with this. And in the darker colors is the most recent numbers in places like Ucayali were relatively remote, or Madre de Dios or Loreto. You have this huge increase in the amount that is getting deforested, and it's correlated with that. So the question then becomes, if we have the time, is, well, what to do? What do you do? What do you do with that political economy of the Amazon that has been transformed from one in which you had this sort of relatively light regulation and a series of activities and movements and organizations to one in which organized crime has become a dominant force, economic and socially. So the interesting thing is that back in 2013, the Organization of American States envisioned a future for drug policy for the entire region. They did this, of course, because at the time there was the hope that there would be some kind of concerted change in policy, and they examined a range of scenarios that came from this giant summit in which they had all kinds of professionals, practitioners, ministers, former presidents, etc. And some of their ideas are actually quite helpful in trying to understand the magnitude and also some of the responses that could be having. So I don't expect you all to read all of this, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is that they have these 4 different scenarios in which they're thinking about how countries can respond together. And here's 2 panels. On the top is how the drug problem or the narcotics problem is understood and what are the problems, what are the challenges for doing that. So in the first scenario called together, the idea is that you can have more enforcement, right? And one of the issues that they had with this more enforcement is that, or one of the challenges that emerges from having more enforcement that's coordinated across countries, is that you expect then that criminal activities are actually shifting from places where you have better control to places where there are weaker institutions. And I would argue that what happened since 2013, when they first proposed this, with the view towards evaluating it in 2025, which they haven't done, one of the things that happened is that effectively countries actually did try to do more of this enforcement and control, and inadvertently have displaced this to the Amazon, which is, in terms of territorial control, especially in the Andean region, is one of the most weakly, right? It's a place with weaker institutions from the Andean side. Then in pathways, you have more experimentation, and this hasn't necessarily happened except by accident. In resilience, and I was hearing some of the ideas that people had about investment in local communities and trying to find alternative jobs. And resilience is a way of thinking about having more investment and local capacities for governance is something that definitely has not been explored at the scale of the policy that was being contemplated. And finally, disruption, which is also something that started happening, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Disruption is a situation in which the countries are actually reacting, each one is reacting differently. And the reason being that the problem of illegal drugs then becomes a problem about how some countries are suffering greater violence than others, right? And so there's that reduction in the enforcement, which again is something that we know happened when the state retracted from a lot of functions having to do with the crisis. And there can be the possible capture of states by criminal organizations and conflicts over violation of international treaty, but we don't see so much of that, but we definitely see aspects of state capture by that. So we see that, this kind of formal analysis that was practiced back then could actually look into the future and map this axis of variation. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to skip about that. And so if we actually try to think about the changes that are happening with more enforcement or less enforcement, then the risks with the rising demand, which is that we have right now, one of the great investments that started happening in 2024 is, for example, the CCPI, which is a transnational police organization in the Amazon. It was slated to spend about $3.2 million. Meanwhile, a single gold mine in Pará was actually yielding about 200 million per year. So that's a situation where the scale at which the response of the prohibition is trying to act when the demand is growing is actually not matched or not even close. And then we have situations in which demand is growing, but the prohibition, the enforcement in prohibition is actually less or is retracting. Then you have drugs can be replaced with other crimes. And we do see some of that in what people were discussing earlier, that the networks that are trafficking with drugs are also trafficking with other things, even fish, as we know very well. Then there are the options for decreasing demand, which is not a scenario that's happening at all. And so I'm not going to dwell too much on it. But there's the problem of actually the economies of scope, meaning that the same transnational networks that are existing right now can actually use their scope for other actions that are still illegal and still clinging to nature. So the conclusion is that simply the idea, which I hear a lot in certain academic circles, that just relaxing the cocaine prohibition is actually going to curb the conservation impact. It's not quite as automatic because this gradients in policy can actually increase crime on one side of the border, or it can make the markets bifurcate. The non-criminal social control then requires the environmental law enforcement to be both robust and transnationally coordinated, because if we actually have these gradients of enforcement across borders, then you're actually just displacing the criminality, as happened with the displacement to that. And some of the things that people were talking about, sustainable legal economic alternatives. And I leave this with the idea that cocaine is just one product. There are other areas of potential intervention having to do with the role of technology, cryptocurrencies, and drones that have been playing a role in increasing role. Other commodities like gold that I'm sure a lot of people in the room are wondering what to do about gold hardwoods and wildlife, but mostly gold. And the challenge is, in reality, the challenge is the organized crime. What tools can be profitably used in that space? And this is, of course, street, graffiti that had to do from last year from the activities of SEVE, and the fact that they had actually implemented their policy. They have created their own transport app for profit. So we have the technological advancement and the actual intervention from the Brazilian government to curb that. And with that, I would like to thank Fulbright Amazonia and my friends from Fulbright Amazonia, some of whom are in the room, for helping with all this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana. Now we have Hernan as our next speaker.
Hello. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a really great pleasure to share the stage with these panelists and all the great people that had long history and very impactful career in conservation and being part of this community. So as part of these panelists and to discuss the topic of illegality and illegal behaviors within the context of natural resources, what I wanted to do is share some perspectives of what I've been working for the last 5 years as part of my PhD program, in terms of trying to understand what are the different complexities of illegal behaviors within wildlife conservation. So to put things in context, illegal behavior has been documented across the world, such as increase in illegal wildlife trade, illegal hunting, increased deforestation and fires within protected areas, and even in scenarios of marine protected areas where fisheries at the local scale and the large scale can be documented. And illegal activities represent a major threat, not only for biodiversity conservation, but also for local people's livelihoods. So when we think in terms of the strategies to reduce illegal behavior, the reduction of illegal and sustainable wildlife use depend on these two key behaviors that we see here. Compliance, meaning that people need to follow regulations, right? If they don't follow regulations, we are not being impactful. Then cooperation, which is a behavior that takes a step further than compliance. It's not only follow the regulations, but people needs to engage actively supporting those management efforts or mandates that have been put in place. However, we have a big challenge, and is that across the different conservation sectors, such as forestry, wildlife, fisheries, non-compliance and lack of cooperation is usually the more often outcome rather than the exception. And what this had led in practice is that for governments and conservation organizations to advocate, to develop top-on-crime policies, create more strict enforcement, or develop more top-down enforcement approaches with more severe sanctions. But when working with coercive approaches, there are several consequences that we need to take in consideration that can actually influence the effectiveness of these regulatory frameworks. So relying only on force can, particularly when the wildlife, the use of natural resources is embedded in cultural and traditional practices, it can create a culture of non-compliance because regulations can feel as illegitimate imposition from external actors. And it can erode, destroy trust, which is necessary for collaborative governance, for example. So also, it can create crime displacement. So regardless of reduction of crime, the crime can be displaced to other areas that are less monitored or are more remote, which is the case of the Amazon basin. Then it can create adaptability of offenders. This means that they can adapt new techniques to hide and to have more advanced in terms of reaching their target. And for example, we have evidence that poachers had moved to more silent and lethal snare approaches rather than using guns that can be detected easily for control rangers. Then we can also have retaliation that has been talked through other presentations. That it means that relying only on force, it can only escalate the violence, and it can create a scenario where witnesses, park ranger, even conservationists are at risk because offenders don't want to be criminalized or be reported on. And lastly, but not least, it can relying only on strict enforcement does not necessarily stop crime, but it can disproportionately impact vulnerable groups while failing to account the complex ecological and social dynamics that actually are driving those illegal behaviors. So these are the factors that we need to consider when working with top-on crime regulations. And based on conservation criminology literature and compliance literature, we know that compliance is not a very straightforward behavior, but it's a complex behavior that requires the interaction of different factors. First, under the consideration of the more traditional deterrence model, which assume that people will comply with regulations because they are fear of being punished, or they perceive of the likelihood of being caught being hide. But also, we know that there are other factors in place that are important to consider when designing these regulations. That, for example, how people perceive the seriousness of crime. How severe is the crime of those activities regarding all the victims that are involved, and how people perceive those seriousness of and severity of harm. Then also what we call the normative model, which focuses on legitimacy and fairness. So people are more likely to comply with regulations when they feel that regulations are fair, respectful, and align with local values and trust in authority and the process that lead to the development of those regulations. And lastly, we have social norms and group pressure that we know that is a good an important factors on the ground, shaping not only compliance behavior, but the way how people are willing to react or to engage in reporting crime, for example. So now I would just provide a very brief example of one of the some of the results of my dissertation regarding to the compliance with illegal wild meat trade in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and to exemplify these complexities with some results. So just to put in context, wild meat, meaning the meat of hunting wildlife species such as large mammals and birds and reptiles. It's an important source across the tropics and not only the Amazon, because it represents the diets of millions of people globally. However, when it's done at unsustainable rates, it can create many consequences, such as it can drive species to extinction, it can spread zoonotic diseases, it can threaten ecosystem services, and it can threaten food security for the people that actually rely on this food as their main source of protein. So wild meat trade becomes illegal when it involves protected species by different laws, national and international laws, and it goes across different jurisdictional areas and borders. So one of the things, and in Ecuador, as long as other areas of the Amazon, we know that despite many conservation efforts and increased law enforcement, these activities prevail in several regions. So one of the things that we wanted to know, in collaboration with WCS Ecuador, we implemented a large-scale survey at the household level to understand what are the different factors that are driving compliance with this wildlife trade. And we implemented a household survey in 2 Amazonian provinces, Orellana and Pastaza, that have 2 different law enforcement levels. Orellana having high levels of law enforcement, and Pastaza having low levels of law enforcement. And we tested different compliance theories to see how are associated with this behavior. And the first compliance theory that we tested is the crime deterrence model, which accounts for the perceived probability of detection, the perceived probability of being sanctioned, and the severity of the sanctions in place. Also, the perceived crime seriousness, which focused on how people perceive the frequency of this trade happening in the areas that they live, and the severity of the impact regarding the wildlife protection, but also as a threat for local livelihoods. And finally, we tested the normative model, which focused on trust, fairness of regulations, effectiveness of regulations, and benefits, and the social norms in the different areas regarding this behavior. So what we found is very interesting. So we found a high prevalence of non-compliance. So more than 60% of the households have engaged in wild meat trade in the last 6 months when the data was collected, regardless of different levels of law enforcement. So, and most of the urban areas concentrated higher trade than rural areas in both provinces. And then when we look at some of the results of the different factors that we conceptualize as influencing compliance, we see that, for example, for the first model, the deterrent model, the only significant factor associated to a decrease in the trade is the perceived risk of being sanctioned. Not the perceived severity of the sanction and not the likelihood of being detected were significant associated with a decrease in the trade. Then in terms of the perceived crime seriousness, we saw that as people perceive the wild meat trade to be more frequent and more common in the area that they live, they were more likely to engage in that trade. And lastly, the normative model, which one of the interesting results is that as people believe that regulations are able to deliver tangible and benefits to the local communities, they were less likely to engage in the trade. So what we can say with these results in the overall and take it for a broader discussion is that not necessarily working in top sentences of top regulations might be a better and can improve compliance, but raising the perception of risk, working in communication, how we are communicating the risk of more certain sanctions rather than severity of sanctions can help us improve compliance. Then also we need to build around legitimacy, strengthen regulatory legitimacy rather than instrumental regulations, right? So through fairness, consistency, enforcement, transparency, involvement of local community in the decisions, because the regulatory frameworks need to make sense for the people in order for them to follow and then to cooperate with those regulations. Then we need to leverage around social norms, addressing social pressures that encourage illegal trade and needs to be tackled, and work around community expectations rather than against them are important strategies that we need to consider. Then tailoring to local context, as I said, so the trade also changes depending on whether they were in rural areas or urban areas. So we need to tailor the strategies that we are implementing, focusing on what are the local contexts, what is the cultural context, what are the local dynamics, and not having broad policy that try to enforce regulations uniformly across the landscape. And finally, we need to shift to a more collaborative governance, because it has been studies that even traditional authorities and traditional way of systems and managing natural resources are more effective in enforcing local regulations rather than external regulations that feel as an imposition for other actors. And lastly, I want to finish with this idea, and that kind of capture everything that I was talking about. That is that lasting compliance can be achieved with regulations are legitimate, socially supported, and aligned with local norms, not just severity of sanctions and not severity of punishment. So with that, I just want to thank you and acknowledge all the organizations that have been supported all this research and interesting results. Yes.
Well, hello. It's
pleasure for me to be here this afternoon for sharing with you some reflections driven by my own work in the Amazon. That's why I want to start by talking about my own research, doctoral research back in 2018. I work focused on examining illegal mining, illegal gold mining in Madre de Dios in Peru. And after that, I didn't go back to the field for many years. And well, I remember that at that time, everything seems like very regulated, like there were a huge body of laws that was designed at that moment. And after 7, almost 8 years, I went back last year, and I just realized that it's not that the impacts of illegal gold mining was still there, but it has been even worse after all of that years, despite that huge legal body. And that makes me realize or start thinking about that maybe despite these decades of really extensive environmental legislation and even advanced monitoring systems, it seems that the Amazon region, as a region, continues to experience persistent illegal mining, deforestation, wildlife trafficking, but also this environmental crime. We're also converging with organized crime, criminal economies, such as drug trafficking, money laundering, and human trafficking that exploit these territories. How do I do this? Sure. Okay, so this suggests that the key explanation is not the absence of law, but the configuration of institutional arrangement that structures the state's response to these overlapping illicit domains, the ones of environmental crime with these other organized criminal economies. That's why I'm developing this research proposal to investigate how these such arrangements shape state responses to promote conservation by reducing environmental and organized crime and criminal activities in one of the most critical ecological regions. But I wanted to recognize that it's different, and that's going to be part of the focus, that is different when the institutional arrangements shape legal responses to environmental crimes that to these organized criminal economies. That's why, as you can see, the research question is proposed as how do institutional arrangement shape the design, the first option, the design and enforcement of legal responses to environmental crimes such as illegal mining, logging, and wildlife trafficking in the Amazon, and also how do these institutional arrangements condition the state's responses, but to organize criminal economies such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, etc., that converge with these environmental territories in the Amazon. My idea was to differentiate how these two institutional arrangements respond directly, differently when the crime, to crimes where the environment itself is the victim, is treated the environment as the victim, to other crimes where environment is not seen as the victim, but as a territorial strategic space. So I am relying on an approach that combines sociological institutionalism with criminological theory, but in a frontier setting. And for me, it's important to take this frontier setting into account because this allows me also to not only discuss this analytical distinction between environmental crime and organized crime, criminal economies, but in these frontier settings, they converge. They cannot be seen as separate. And finally, also allows me to examine how these institutional arrangements are working and how they shape the state responses for these both criminal categories at the same time. Okay, with regard to the analytical distinction, just to differentiate that environmental crimes is a concept that came from the green criminology literature, where the environment, as I already said, is the victim, is the direct victim of crime, such as in illegal mining, illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, but the convergent organized crime that is not related with the green criminology literature is where the environment is not the primary target, but becomes involved, structurally implicated, like in the cases of drug trafficking, human trafficking, toxics, smuggling, like the case of mercury. But the Amazon is this frontier governance space, is particular in that sense. And that's why it's important to recognize that environmental crime and organized crime in this space could not remain separate. There is this criminal convergence, and this criminal convergence form this kind of hybrid criminal economies or even criminal governance, where, for instance, illegal mining allow for laundering of drug money, or logging routes facilitate trafficking, drug trafficking, or any other form of trafficking, or armed groups protect these extractive sites, or human trafficking supports mining camps. So they can be really separate. And finally, regarding the institutional arrangements are not simply a function of state capacity. There's some research about the state's capacities to respond, but in this sense, institutional arrangements is a broader approach, considering also legal, political capacities, as well as the design of law, but also the implementation of law and the implementations of policies that at the end are the ones that enable these state responses to effectively prevent or to effectively control crime. It means that these institutional arrangements are the ones that can enable the state responses. In the context, such as in the Amazon, of criminal convergence, these institutional arrangements are those that need to be examined. Sorry. Before going to that comparative approach, this arrangement needs to be examined because whether enforcement is fragmented or is integrated is going to depend on that, as the same as if there is a coordination between environmental and security agencies, or whether cases are prosecuted or only administratively settled, or where enforcement is only symbolic or is only sustained, or whether there are governance gaps that criminal organizations can exploit, is going to depend on these institutional arrangements. So finally, regarding this approach, this comparative approach, just to, again, differentiate this environmental crime and these drugs, but also organized crime, regarding lead actors, for instance, in the case of environmental crime, is usually environmental agency that has the main role, while in organized crime is the federal police or sometimes a military, armed force, and that generates also different state responses to this convergence of crime, like in the case of illegal mining. Is the environmental agency the one that is responsible for controlling, for reducing that, or is the police and military? And we can see that the response was usually using that different approach, this approach that highlights a security-centered enforcement logic versus a more regulatory approach that is the one taken for the environmental crime. Regarding the legal regime, in cases of environmental crime, is usually more administrative. In cases of organized crime, it's more based on a criminal code. The enforcement, even the enforcement logic in case of environmental crimes, is more focused on economic sanctions or fines, and organized crimes, of course, prison, asset seizure. Regarding monitoring, environmental crimes, more based on satellite environmental system. In the case of organized crime, intelligence network. And finally, international cooperation to prevent or to control. Environmental crimes are more based on environmental treaties, while organized crime more based on the security and anti-narcotics regimes. Just to mention some, or the approach is, of course, or has to be based on this mixed method approach with a multi-level research designs that is going to consider 3 different tools, methodological tools, and institutional and policy analysis, and spatial and remote sensing data, and secondary qualitative and quantitative data from criminal, environmental, and enforcement reports, such as court records or reports from NGOs and international agencies. But finally, I think that regarding illegal activities, it's important to take into account these research concerns that I know that we have seen this increasing in the last years. And it's important just to take into account that given this safety issue, the illegality of the activities, is important sometimes to rely on more secondary, more remote, or more expert-provided data, which implies remote engagement sometimes for interviews that could be conducted via some of these other tools that we have now. Data triangulation with more satellite or a stakeholder to reduce reliance only on one single source. And I think that ethical compliance is also really, really important as a discussion, because the anonymization of sensitive stakeholder information is also key nowadays, to have this adherence to safety protocols for local partners as well. Well, that was all I wanted to present today, just to share these reflections. Thank you so much.